This is session, I think, 5. Is it 5 we're on? I don't remember. This is session 5 for those of you joining us online. Today we're going to look at our biblical timeline, picking up from Moses, where we left off, sort of the Israelites entering into slavery, and then carrying on all the way up through the divided kingdom. So which pretty much the overall picture is you have the development of a nation, you have the identity of a nation in Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You have the transfer to Egypt through Joseph. This is where they build as a people, but they lose their identity. So now we're about to enter that beginning of the story where the Exodus begins, and you start to actually see the 50,000 foot perspective is you're starting to see God take an active presence in their formation. Prior to this, there hasn't been much instruction. Sin did not really exist as a category of understanding. It's just as Paul writes, sin didn't exist before the law. So before the Ten Commandments, what we're going to talk about today, that happened at the desert, the mountain that take them down. Before that, there was no law against stealing things. Maybe if they sat down and had a conversation, they would think it wasn't right, but it wasn't held against them. It was just sort of the state of wickedness, state of evilness that God didn't like, but it wasn't like specific things. It wasn't defined. It wasn't understood in a way that they talked about or wrote about. I share often, and every time I share the story, and I'm sure many of you have heard me say this before, but for those who haven't, I love the video, the Bible Stories episode of The Simpsons. If you haven't seen it, I'm sure it's online. If you Google Simpsons Bible Stories, it shows the narrative of Moses coming down and giving the Ten Commandments. And they always have Homer pickpocketing as it is announced, as Moses is saying from the mountain, "Thou shalt not steal." And Homer in Homer-like fashion goes, "Don't!" And, right as, now he can't do that anymore. That formation from establishing Sabbath to giving them the Ten Commandments to giving them God's presence, you're going to see the formation, and then God steps in and guides them through first priests. You get in the 12 tribes, then judges through. We'll talk about that through a period and then they move into the king, the prophets, a prophet, I guess. You get Samuel as sort of a prophet / judge. He kind of bridges that gap. Kings, and then finally prophets in a more fuller sense of what we think of prophet when we think of prophet. And that'll lead us up to today. So today we have some fun stuff, though. So if you're keeping track of your top tens, I think there are some things that we ought to, I was like, could I do these? So I have one exercise that we're going to try. Something you at home might need a piece of paper and a pencil. It can be a scrap. You're not going to keep it, but I'm going to try a pedagogical exercise to help us remember some of these things. But let's pick up the story where we left off last week. And when we left off last week, we left off with the Israelites in slavery, and I do believe it was 1446. Do you have the last week's ones? On the third page, does it say Israelites for? Israelites enslaved, 1446.
Exodus 1.
So 1446 is the end of end of slavery, or marked as the end of slavery, but it also, and again, these are estimated, so I don't even remember where I got them from, but I took them wholeheartedly from the one that I decided to and just committed. But you're going to see a series of 1446, and essentially what it's saying is from the burning bush to the 10 plagues to the crossing, the Exodus, the crossing of the Red Sea, to the manna and water, to the Mosaic covenant. All 5 of those pieces of movement happened in a period. And rather than divide into one, by year, I don't know how long it took. I mean, the plagues, I imagine, weren't like spread out over a 5-year period. These sort of things unfold. And so we want to just make sure but the reason I'm saying that is that on your cards, you'll see that there is a 1525, and you'll say, well, on the last set, Jason, you started with the Israelites in slavery in 1446. The 1446 is meant to be the date that they ended their slavery. We don't really know when it began. It developed sometime during their growth. We saw that. We read that last week. In terms of the Pharaoh saying they're growing in number, we need to subjugate them. So in the midst of that, towards the end of that time of slavery in 1525, we have the beginning of one of I would say, the most known biblical stories of our age, in particular for boomers, Xers, and maybe some millennials. And I think it is largely attributed to the movie The Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston. I think the church knows about these things, but I think culturally that was a huge move. They used to show this on TV along with, and so there was a whole generation of people who even though they might not have been churched, the story of the Exodus and the Ten Commandments will be something that's a part of their, and I mean, even, what is it, Pixar or Dreamscape, one of them did the Moses story, what was that one called? The Son of Pharaoh, or I don't know what it's called, Prince of Egypt, yeah. Which actually I is one of the few like biblical animated films that I actually do enjoy. I think they embellished where they did, as any project that produces anything would, but I do think it's a good story. But it marks the beginning of again, God intervening. It involves a baby. Probably the second most significant baby after the next most significant baby after Isaac, in the birth of Isaac. This in many ways is like, again, Isaac becomes this single person through which everything comes from. Everything that is about to begin again comes through this narrative of a baby, and you have the motif of the water and the basket, which echoes the ark and floating on the water, and the salvation coming through the ark, which is a theme that runs through Scripture and through church history in various ways too. So when you think about baby Moses, don't just think about the cute narrative that our Sunday school programs want to portray, the idea, Moses. I mean, you're sticking a baby in crocodile-infested waters that are, and sending a child to wade along the side to make sure what? Just to report if an alligator, they could have went 1,000 different directions and probably should have. Not to mention when the baby is found in a statewide or a citywide, or countrywide edict that said any males should be killed. And then you have this like miraculous sort of connection between the Pharaoh's daughter and their own palace, knowing that this was a Jewish baby, knowing that this was, would probably, who knows, you want to talk about father-daughter relations, so kind of a rebellious daughter syndrome or whatever. She's like, I'm going to show him, I'm going to raise this Jewish baby on my own. The people that were their slaves. And so she decides, for whatever reason, it's a baby from the gods. I don't know why. You think about the story, why the Pharaoh was like, I don't know. Last time I checked, she wasn't pregnant, but here she's got a baby. My guess is that between the maidservants and the concubines and the wives, there were lots of children running around. And it was more a slip into the crowd than it was. Otherwise, why would the Pharaoh be like, okay, you found a baby in a basket floating down the Nile? Sure, welcome him into the home. I mean, like, that just makes zero sense. So what you see in this is God's providence. Salvation in the form of a baby, echoes of Isaac, foreshadowing of Christ. Like, that imagery is an important image in the history and tradition of salvation. So when you think about the birth narrative, think about the basket as a symbol of God's providence, even water as in this case of turning water as a place of salvation as opposed to a place of death. And then the notion of providence going all the way back to God choosing Jacob over Esau, God choosing Isaac over Ishmael, God choosing Joseph to be the one to ultimately save them, and even Joseph acknowledges the providential nature of what was intended for evil, God used for good. And so through all of this, you see a God that is intervening in the world, but in various ways. So I like to think of the Spirit sort of guiding that basket along. The next thing you have, and I mean, there's lots that you can fill in from the narrative of Moses growing up in the palace, having some realization that he might be Jewish. Puts, the movie portrays it, the narrative probably drives, the movie drives than the actual biblical narrative, but Moses discovers he's Jewish. He escapes Egypt. He goes and lives amongst shepherds, and eventually, has no intention other than just to get out of the palace, no intention of being this sort of savior figure or a prophet, or the one who brings the law or the next covenant. It's just not there. But he goes and he encounters God in the burning bush. And this sort of starts again the same year of the end of the slavery, because all of these coalesce. And I think this is an important place. The burning bush is one of the most significant passages in the entirety of the Bible. I don't want to take a gander or guess why. Why is this narrative so important? You answered this question, actually. God tells us who he is. It's the first formal introduction since Adam and Eve. I mean, that's a casual way of saying it. On a more serious note, this is one of the most defining passages that we have in revealing who God is, and drives everything in our understanding that comes before it and everything that will come after it. In the burning bush, he says, "This is holy ground, take off your sandals, come before me. I want you to go to Egypt to rescue my people." And he says, blah, 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 I can't do it. And he says, I'll sit there with you. And then he says, I just think it's bizarre. Like, well, I got to tell them who sent me. Who should I tell them who sent me? And God says, I am, or I am that I am. And this is the Hebrew word, and I'm not a linguist, but I do remember studying the language, is the verb to be, être in French, I think, or in Hebrew understanding of the verb to be, to exist. And what God said was, I am that I am, or I am the one who exists, or in one Hebrew interpretation or one Hebrew translation is he who brings into existence all that exists. The letters typically understood are YHWH without any vowels, because Hebrew did not originally have vowels in it, and the Masoretic scribes added those vowels, and so that's why you get the Yahweh that has some vowels in there. And the Jews will call this a tetragrammaton. That's like tetra, T-R-T-R-A, and then gram, G-R-A-M-M-A-T-O-N. And it's a word that they will not say. And so anywhere like if you look in your Bible, in most translations, anywhere in the Old Testament or in the New Testament, when Jews are writing the name of God, they're going to write it as capital letters L-O-R-D, Lord. And what they mean by this is Yahweh, or this tetragrammaton.
What are the four letters again?
Y-H-W-H. I can't remember, I'm having problems today. Y-H-W-H. And then if you spell that, you would put you would put a A and a E.
Mm-hmm. So that's how they get Yahweh.
Yahweh.
And
Jews won't typically,
even today, some Jews, they won't spell out even God. They'll just put like G blank space D.
Yeah.
It's the same idea, right?
Same concept.
Like it's so holy, we can't even say it.
Anywhere you meet, and so they also have the word Lord, and in the Old Testament, and if you in your English translations, if you see English L small case O-R-D, like capital L or a small lowercase L, what's that? Like how you'd write Lord, typically. It is the translation of the word Adonai, which actually just means Lord or Lord in Hebrew, but not God's name, Lord. So Lord versus, the Lord. But what's important about it, and what I want to stress, is this is God directly giving us not just his name, but a statement of existence. And I've preached on this before, and I've said this in sermons, but this is a statement of I am. The sense of, in the existential movement with Rene Descartes, I think, therefore I am. And what Rene Descartes is saying is, because I can rationally understand myself thinking, because I can self-reflect, I recognize that I exist. And what God is saying is, not I do this, therefore I am. He is just saying, I am. And so when you put this story, this part of the narrative, and this statement of who God is, and then you jumped ahead, as we will in the New Testament, I think it's Luke or John, I think it's John, that has all of these I am statements. I am the way, I am the truth, I am. And so there's a heavy connection throughout the history of theology between the I am statements of who Christ is and the existence of, because Christ isn't just saying, I am the way, I'm a gay, I am. And this is what also makes Christianity uniquely different. And when we did all the different religions of the world, and one of the things I kept coming back to is what differentiates Christianity is we believe that Christ is the fullest revelation of God and the way that God has provided. As a theologian, that doesn't mean that I would say that God can't provide other ways to salvation and through other means. It also doesn't mean there aren't like other worlds or other times, other things happening. Like, I'm not one to deny that which I should have no opinion on those. I can have speculations because I don't know. So God can reconcile who God wants to reconcile in whatever way God wants to reconcile them. But to those of us in this world, Christ revealed himself as the I am, that is the gate, that is the way, that is the truth. And so we go with that. Yeah, yeah, of course.
So I always think of sort of the Jewish people starting with Abraham.
Yeah.
And obviously God had to reveal himself to Abraham. But this is obviously very impactful. Like, to some extent, this is the beginning. But presumably, in other words, how did God reveal himself to Abraham? I don't remember.
Yeah, how did he give him the covenant?
We don't have, you mean the covenant, a voice? It doesn't say, the angelic figures, which have been interpreted have been interpreted both as God sometimes and not as God. And I think there's just the notion of, in the case of if they ran into an angelic figure, I think if we ran into an angel that was in all of the angel's glory, we might think it was God.
Well, I always think of when he made the covenant and he had them split the animals.
Yeah.
And there was blood that ran down because they made covenants that way, and then they were to walk, the two people. And Abraham was afraid because he knew he could never, and he had the lantern appeared and went in Abraham's place. And to me, that's another form of fire God was.
And that's how he knew it was God.
And again,
that's how he knew he was.
Remember, by this time in the story, none of this had been written down.
Right. Yeah.
Well, Moses wrote it all.
Yes.
But he was delivered to the Egyptians as a baby. Where did he obtain the knowledge of his ancestors?
This is why and did you start from the beginning of these when you listened to them? So when we were talking about the Torah being the Torah, which is the whole thing, but more specifically, it's the first 5 books, the Pentateuch. Those first 5 books are considered sacred from God, dictated to Moses.
Okay.
One of the biggest challenges of that is that God also dictates to Moses his own death. But that also doesn't mean that things weren't added, because things get added to text all the time. So what we stand on is that the original dictation of these first 5 books were given by God to Moses. That doesn't mean that there weren't traditions. If you really want to get a trippy interpretation of it that I actually have appreciation for, is Jordan Peterson actually does some interesting things around dream sequences and how they pass on and not denying that God told Moses these things, but in other words, that God used dreams to communicate them, because we don't know how God told them to Moses either. I mean, we don't know the mode of transit. This is the challenge of the New Testament books. When we say when Paul wrote down, was Paul in a trance when he was writing these things down? Probably not. Were the apostle writers? Probably not. I mean, even with all the things we've already covered. I mean, but the first 5 books are probably the ones that we hold. Even I would say, as a Christian, I would probably hold as being from God, representing what had happened, but still leaves lots of room for ambiguity. I mean, again, why do we have two creation narratives? Why did Moses start one creation narrative and then pick it up? And then they start looking at these different versions or different parts of it. My suspicion is that it all could have been sourced from Moses, but over time, things get passed down, things get changed, and they come together. So, but nonetheless, Jews hold it as sacred. Okay, 10 plagues, fun stuff. Can you name them? Can you name them? Huh? So here's what we're going to do. This is where you need a piece of paper at home. Take a piece of paper, or if you need a piece of paper, pass it, take a piece of paper, or you can do it on this if you have something at home. I don't know if this is going to work, but we're going to try it.
Weren't there snakes?
That was,
People got bit by a snake, but that was
All right.
God did that to the Jewish people, didn't he?
You can do it in color if you want. So first thing we're going to do is you're just going to draw a pyramid, and you're going to do it could just be a triangle, and then draw some land. So we're establishing. It could looks a little like Pink Floyd. In front of the Pink Floyd album, but it doesn't have to be fancy. Just draw, and you at home could do the same if you want. So this is Egypt. We've established that Egypt's here. If you want, we're going to need a river, so you can draw a river, because this is the first plague. And I know that you don't necessarily want to get out, so you can draw a river running through it, and you can give it some color if you want. So the first plague is blood in the River Nile. Now, the River Nile is a gigantic river. This isn't the trickle, this isn't the Savoia, this is and this thing, as the movie depicted, the serpent, he touched his rod and it turned it red. It wasn't a plague, he did a little trick with the serpent thing, turned his rod into a snake, and that didn't work, so he touches Moses touches his rod to the river, and it turns red. So my hope is that as you draw this, you'll get some sense. So the second one is frogs. So you can draw them however you want it, but draw a frog there. And I don't even know how to draw a frog now I'm thinking about it.
Draw the root figure.
Huh? Yeah, I don't know. This does not look like, mine does not look like a frog, but.
Oh, there's my frog.
So draw a frog. You just draw one, and you can write ribbit next to it, so you know that it's a frog, because later you might have some confusions. So frog was number 2. You can even number them. And these are the sort of things that if you wanted to know, hopefully this will be an activity that will, frogs are number 2. You can do it wherever you want. The third one are gnats. But some interpret that as lice. So you can, and there are going to be some other flying creatures to come. So you might want to draw a person, just a stick person.
No seams, yeah.
A stick person, and you can draw some bugs coming off them. And I don't know if you at home are doing this,
Well, it
but.
makes me think of if y'all are VeggieTale people, are you calling me a good
Jason, show us the picture again.
Okay, you mean the one I'm drawing? So there's my pyramid. You can use mine, and then I put a 1 by the red Nile that's not red, but it's dark, and then I did a frog here that doesn't really look like a frog, and then this is a dude here in a robe, because I started to draw a stick man, but then I decided to get a little more elaborate, and I drew him itching. He's itching his back here, and he's got a mad face because he's not happy. So that's number 3. So number 1, what are they?
Turn the river to blood.
River red. Number 2,
Plague of frogs.
frogs. Ribbit. Number 3,
Gnats.
itch. Okay, number 4 is flies. That's why I said don't get too crazy with so you can do the flies everywhere. Just put all over the. I think flies go higher then lice are
I don't know,
actually,
how do you distinguish a fly from a gnat?
well, that's what I'm saying, is that's why I said maybe the lice are better because they are on, flies don't bite you. Well, I guess they
Yes,
do.
they do.
Yes, they
I mean,
do.
not like lice do. They can.
They have big eyes.
Okay, so I got a 4, so you can see, I'll share mine with you. I just drew some dots. All right. Okay, the 5th one is pestilence of livestock. So this is the one you get to draw a dead horse or a dead donkey on its side. And again, I'm not claiming to be an artist, so, but
What was it? Hoof and-
hoof and mouth disease, it was the earliest form of mad cow disease.
I can't draw dead horse.
Okay, so here I drew mine here. You can see there, a little donkey there or something drawn. And that donkey there is got his tongue out showing, and he's got an X on his eyes to show that he's dead. So that's 5. All right, so together, what is the first one? River, what is it?
Now,
Frogs. Now there's a third?
Gnats.
Lice or gnats. And a 4th?
Flies.
5th? Pestilence. Okay, number 6, boils.
Oh.
Now you can draw another person, and you can and give them just some boils on their body, and a little angry face, because I'm sure those don't feel good. You guys want to see it, my picture at home? Do you guys want to see it at home on the online? Here's I told you I'm not. There's my boil guy.
The boils were on animals too.
I'll put some on the donkey then too, the dead donkey.
Yeah.
There, now he's spotted. Now he got double hit.
Boils.
Well, then, the funny thing is that then there's a third round for the livestock. Now I think about it, as I draw this out, they were getting pelted. The after 6, which is the boils, and then the 7th is hail. So now that can be distinguished from your flies by actually making circles, and then you can actually do like the comic book like line above it, like it's following. And you can even have some hit the animals, because it does say it affected their crops, their trees, and their livestock. So that is number 7. I'll show you my picture of the boils. All right. And then the hail, that was number 7 is hail. Number 8 is locusts. And that pretty much was devoured anything at that point that hadn't been left. So you can just put some hash marks somewhere, and you can put some bugs around them. Locusts I believe, are cicadas, at least in our understanding of what they are. That would be a cicada, those boxy things that fly around and just munch on stuff.
I grew a grasshopper, so.
Yeah.
So, I guess grasshoppers maybe also could be in that. They probably are. Obviously, it was a flying animal that flew in. I think one of the films showed this like swarm coming in. That's pretty vicious. All right, I'll show you mine. Mine's over here by Egypt. I did some.
There's something like that also happens in Revelation too, this big,
In what?
in Revelation.
Yeah, it's interesting how God these sort of natural features come into.
They work.
Hail,
Anything could be a plague, I guess, and then the 9th is darkness. So you can, I don't know how you want to do that, and it lasted 3 days. And so imagine the moon going, and the sun and the moon no longer being around for 3 days. If that happened here in Lake City and it was pitch darkness, it would be, up here we know that darkness. So imagine, when it's really dark on a dark sky, that there was no light. It would be eerie. And then the final one is the death of the newborn, or all firstborn children of Egyptians. And this is actually not just the worst, and this is the one that bless you, Ken, that I also go back to saying the notion that God is a pure, loving God and could never do anything that humans might find reprehensible is a postmodern distortion and a distorted view of God. Now, we can say God is all love. We can just say our understanding of love is faulty. But the fact of the matter is, God sent a plague, or God released, or by God's permission, or by God's hand, or however you want to define it, but God sent these plagues in order to sway the Pharaoh, and the final one did it. But God killed those babies. And for me, this is why, a lot of people don't want to go there and say that, but I would rather go and say I don't understand the fullness of God's love or the fullness of God's providence and put myself in the error in this place of fault than deny the story or redefine an image of God that is incongruent with something that we as Christians and as Jews hold as the most sacred of texts. Is that fair? So, okay, so now you've done all these plagues.
At least it was last.
It was what?
At least he did all this other stuff first, and it didn't work.
Well, it's kind of like if
So at
you
least he
know,
did it last.
I know if Pharaoh would have just gave up at the blood in the river,
Yeah, if he did,
he would have saved
no
himself a
babies
lot of
would have died.
problems.
Right.
Yeah,
It says
he
that God
left.
wanted him to, like, God made
God
him
hardened
not.
his heart, yeah. It does. It does say God hardened his heart, and I will say, good job, Silas, that God hardened his heart. And that passage is very interesting, and you don't have to remember this, but it's just worthwhile knowing and hearing. God hardened, it said, Pharaoh hardened his heart, Pharaoh hardened his heart, Pharaoh hardened his heart, God hardened his heart. And so the passage points to, and so Lutherans actually understand this as humans having the capacity to resist God. And Calvin, in a more reformed view, God can't be resisted. We are here because God providentially brought us here. We've accepted Christ as our Lord and Savior because God orchestrated that. In the Lutheran schema of things, God providentially will approach you, but you can harden your heart to God to the point that then God will turn you into the reprobate. This is how Luther avoided these stark categories of elect and reprobate, as God defining those. In other words, someone can go from a place of openness to a place of reprobate because they harden their heart towards God.
So the Lutherans are more on the free will side of things?
They're kind of in between Arminians who believe in free will and Reformed who believe purely in, and really there are, even in Reformed circles, no one fully believes in absolute. CRC would be the closest we would get. Glenda's, I'm not saying you believe that, Glenda, but you're
I see a lot of similarities here with what you see happening in Revelation, where things will happen and some people choose to believe it, many don't, and you think, how can those people still resist? And then the next thing happens, and you're like, and people still resisted, and then this next thing happened, and people still resisted, and there were remnants left. And he protected the Jews here. There was but it's the same in our own life. I mean, God reveals his goodness to us, and we still, at times, don't acknowledge it or don't,
Just look at the attendance at church. Good influence.
okay. So turn your papers over. What are the plagues? What's the first one?
Oh, man.
Blood. What's
Frogs,
frogs,
gnats,
gnats,
Flies.
flies, the two flying ones, and then what? No,
no pestilence.
the dead animals.
Pestilence,
Yeah,
yeah.
pestilence.
And walls.
Then what? What's
Now
6?
spoils.
Boils. 7.
7 is
Hail. 8.
8 is.
Dark.
Is it
No?
darkness yet? No. After hail came.
Locust eat it all.
Locust. Good job.
Thank you, Jim.
Locust. Then how many days of darkness?
3 days.
3 days.
In the final
Then
plague.
we killed the babies.
And yeah, the killing of the babies. And remember, the Israelites were spared of that. So the Israelites, had the Israelites not had blood over their doorposts, they too, this is the first Passover. So not only does the 10th plague mark the end of slavery, it marks the first sign of redemption in terms of the Israelites for 426 years or whatever it was. Because God gives them, again, tying it to the sacrificial lamb. So by the blood of another, an innocent lamb, the Israelites were saved. And you see these threads running through again, the sense of that atonement. Okay, so hopefully that'll help you. You can take your pictures. If you put them, you can put them in your folders. You can throw them away, do whatever you want with them. So we carry on in 1446 with the crossing of the Red Sea. The Israelites grab what they can. This is the notion of the unleavened bread. They didn't have time to let it rise because they had to escape. Conceivably, and again, I don't know the exact timeline, the night after the dead babies were there and Pharaoh said, no, I'm done, they were like hightailing it out. Like there's no time to waste. They grabbed what they could. They were probably not prepared. They probably could have taken more. They didn't have Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts yet in society, so they didn't learn to prepare for these long journeys. They had only known Egypt. Probably most of them had only known one home, and they had only known that part of Egypt where they existed. So imagine going, we travel all over the place. Our sense of geography is vast. Imagine going in a situation where you have been in slavery and all of a sudden you're like, nah, bless you. It'd kind of be like if you were somehow, you got in trouble and you were like in the middle of, some far off place in the world in the middle of Africa, and you were in a prison and you were there most of your life to the point where you'd forgotten any sort of civilization, where you came from, and then they were like, okay, you can leave. And you're like, well, where do I go? Well, God led them through Moses, through the crossing of the Red Sea, and this is, again, the use of water for redemption. Now, the splitting of the water, the moving of the water, the changing of the molecules brings about this form of redemption. They cross over into dry land, and as the story goes, then God put the waters back on the Egyptians as they crossed over. I always thought the timing of that was kind of interesting, but and honestly, I think the best way to, if you really want to hold the story in your memory, is the Ten Commandments. Not that they do a perfect job of it, but they do about as good as a job of it as you probably can find. What's that?
Year was that?
Someone said something?
What year was that?
Oh, we're still in 1446.
1446?
Yeah, this all happened. And again, I would say number 4 is where I don't know, from when they crossed the Red Sea, I don't think it was long. It's not long, it's only a couple chapters, but I mean, that doesn't give us any sense of time. But the number 4 of the 1446, the manna and water, these, and actually quail, it's often not listed, but quail was actually given as well. But this is also another important passage. The water is God providing for them, and honestly, this problem is like it's not unreasonable that they didn't have anything to drink, and they were grumpy. If I were in a hot desert, and if I don't bring enough water on a hike, and I'm like, man, I'm so stupid, and I'm mad at myself for like the last 2 hours as I sip at this little bit of warm water. They were probably, and then even then, the amount of them were out there, and this water comes out of the rock, and so God provides. The passage is important mostly because you'll see in the sky the sense of manna coming down on the card, but manna was a sign of provision, but manna is really not important. What is important is the shift. This is the first act of defining the Israelites post-slavery. This is the establishment of Sabbath. And what God says is you're going to collect, you can eat, each day you're going to take what you have, and the next day, if you try to save any extra, it's going to spoil. And on the 7th day, I don't want you to work. So on this day, on the 6th day, you can collect extra, you can work extra, you can gather extra, and it won't spoil. And as the scripture tells us, when they saved extra, because obviously they're like, I don't know if I really believe him, let's give it a go. And it was rotting and mold and had maggots or whatever in it. And then but for the 7th day, for the Sabbath day, they didn't have to collect. And wasn't like loaves of bread coming down. I don't know if you've heard these before. It was powder. They were essentially pulling almost like flour powder off of, so it was an arduous task of doing this, but it was the grains that they were familiar, or something that they could make a bread out of. Why this is important is we often think, when we think of Sabbath or Sunday, the Lord's Day, as being something that God instituted in creation. There's no word in the creative story that mentions the word Sabbath. Sabbath, which means in Hebrew to cease. Shabbat means to cease, to stop. And you could say God rested. And to cease and to rest have a Venn diagram overlap pretty well. But just because you ceased doing something does not mean you were resting. So God rested from creation on the seventh day. It was a pattern that was created that then was given to the Israel in this narrative. The reason Jews celebrate Sabbath or observe Sabbath is because it was given to them in this passage, in this part of the narrative. And what God said was, stop your earthly labor. And what is beautiful about this is that it is a break in the curse that God gave humanity. So in the fall narrative, God said to Adam, I give you the seed or the plants of the earth for your food. You're going to have to work it by the sweat of your brow until your death. You're going to work for your food. There was no break. You think they had Sundays off in slavery for 400 and something? They were people that worked every single day was Groundhog Day, essentially. And now they've escaped. God provides for them. And the very first thing he says, they've done nothing to earn it. They're complaining. He says, I'm going to give you rest. Something that they as a people had never, ever experienced before, the very notion of it. And what he said is, I'm going to have you exchange your labor for not labor. And I'm not doing that so you can rest like I did after 7 days of creation. I'm going to give this so that you can worship me, so that you can preserve this day for sacred, holy rhythms. It is set apart from those days of labor. It is set apart so they don't have to worry about their sustenance, their existence. And the Sabbath was established to remind them of and this is modern Jewish thought, but dominant Joshua Abraham Eshel, someone I used a lot in my dissertation, says that Sabbath established in this narrative is a reminder of the paradise lost and a foretaste of what is yet to come. So in every Shabbat, in every Sabbath that a Jewish person celebrates on a Saturday, they're meant to experience the foretaste of heaven. This is why it is essentially communal. This is why it does not involve labor. This is why you're meant to reconcile and to prepare yourself for it, because when you go into it, you're meant to be in a space where you're in paradise. You all know I studied Tizay. This is why I compared Tizay to Sabbath, because for people who go to Tizay, they feel like they're setting aside 51 weeks of their year in exchange for a week where they enter into a Sabbath community, where they exchange their earthly rhythms or earthly daily patterns for an entirely new rhythm that are set and designed around the holiness of worship of God. So when we think about manna in the water, think about it in terms of the significance of the establishment of Sabbath for the Jews. And then you say, well, we're not Jewish, we don't celebrate the Sabbath. By extension, through the history of the church, the Lord's Day was, in meaning the day that, is that cat going to jump in the toilet? Cat was looking to jump in the toilet. Yeah. Get out of here, you toilet drinkers. I shoo anyone away who drinks from the toilet, including people. That happened. God provide. This is the first act to give them rest. This is the first thing that defines them. The next thing is the Mosaic covenant. And I think that this is also a major piece. When anytime in the New Testament you hear someone talking about the law, they are talking about this narrative and the things that followed in Levitical law that came out of it. But and this sort of caps off this period, this sort of stretch that goes from what really was the Exodus, I would sort of put the burning bush when God calls Moses. I don't think there was a lot of time in between, to the point where he was also coming back down from the mountain. He came back down to fulfill the call, and he came back down to deliver the law. So he was, in some sense, Moses was the prophet, Moses, where he prophesied what would happen, and now Moses is the lawgiver. So Moses comes down and he gives them the Decalogue, and we all know the story. He goes up, he comes down. They've created a false idol. He gets mad. He throws it at them. or he slams down the thing, he's got to go back up. You know, it's a great story. But now we talk about the Ten Commandments, and I do want to so the Ten Commandments I do think are things that we should know, and right now the Ten Commandments have been actually in a lot of public debate, once again, whether or not it should be in our public schools. Just so you know, I'm of the opinion that it should not be. I think it's fine, hang them around the church, stick them in every Bible, stick them in your room at home, stick them in your bathroom, I don't really care. It's a public school, and by virtue of the fact that it's public doesn't mean, and that doesn't mean that someone who was Jewish, I mean, obviously they wouldn't mind it maybe as much, someone who is, Muslim, I think would probably say, we're Abrahamic, this is kind of goes in the line. Maybe, these aren't unreasonable things. I think most religions globally would not disagree with any of the sentiments, but I don't want the 10 laws of Confucius or of Islam being on the wall any more than I do the 10 Commandments. These were given to Israel, and these are not necessary. And sometimes we say this was it. This was the most important thing. I think this was God saying, "You're all a bunch of morons. I'm going to give you some basic things to guide you." Like, these are big categories. And as we know, and I'll say it now, they're broken up into how you relate to God and how you relate to others. It goes 4 and then 6. This is the same thing that Jesus says when they say and when he's tested by the Pharisees and the Sadducees about the law, what's the greatest? And he says, love the Lord God with all your heart, soul, and mind. And that statement there is encompassed in these first 4 commandments. Love your neighbor as yourself, encompassed in the last 6. And by neighbor, we need to extrapolate that to mean anyone other than yourself, even your spouse. So let's go through them real quick. I'm going to spend a whole lot of time on them. No other gods. So the first one is no other gods before me. Thou shalt have no other gods. This points to the fact that they were Yahwehists. Which was really, so again, the dominant view from a lot of religions at the time, that the argument over who had the best God. And so the Jews felt like their God was the best God. They weren't denying the existence of other gods. They were merely saying, our God is better than your God. Well, my dad is better. My dad could beat your dad up. That's what they were saying. Later, after exile, they become monotheists. So it acknowledges the fact that God's self recognizes that there are other gods in the world. And that's an important thing to remember. 2, thou shalt not make graven images or idols. And graven meaning serious, and idols meaning anything that represents, and Levitical laws will go into this more about the nature of those idols. But basically, humans are not going to create gods or images of those gods. This is why many in Christianity have a problem with Hinduism, because the idea is that those gods were created, or representations of that. But not to make any graven images or idols or anything related to that we might worship. Now, you might say you want to extrapolate that into the notion of thou shalt not make graven images or idols. What we often say in our modern day world, we worship money. Money is an idol. Fame is an idol. Power is an idol. An idol is that which you worship. Now, was he talking about that in this? He wasn't talking ideologically, but the same principle is there, that God wants our worship solely reserved for him. And if we put our affections to the point that it tips that balance towards something that is other than God, that's a violation of this commandment. So in other words, and the reason I'm saying this is that I don't want you to go home, you're like, I haven't made any weird looking statues today, so I guess I'm okay on the second commandment. I think the second commandment carries a lot more weight than we give it credit. The idea is that everything comes from God. We worship God through and through. 3, take not the Lord's name in vain. This is largely where the Jews would have get the notion of the tetragrammaton, that they would not want, and they wouldn't use that word, the Yahweh. That was too sacred. So not taking the Lord's name in vain meant writing it as Lord or using other replacements for that.
I heard it meant not to, wear his name inappropriately, in other words, not to misrepresent God.
Yes, and I think it would have been, I mean, obviously, that's just funny as you say that, because when you were saying not to wear, I was like, I wonder what that means for the billions of dumb Jesus t-shirts they have out there. Are we taking the reverence of who God is in vain by trivializing Jesus into our buddy? Perhaps. I don't think this is, to be clear, I don't think people will use pardon my language for the moment for purpose of example, but when people say God damned, people often think you're using God's name in vain. I don't think that's saying God's name in vain, because one, God is a general term. That's not God's name. Like, God never said, call me God. That is a term we use for a deity against also no other gods before me. God himself is using it in the terms of what it represents. It's not about the reason the phrase God damned or God damn is bad, or I think problematic, is because we ought to never wish that God would damn anything. And so it says, I think when people use that callously, I mean, I do think, and I like to say when people use Jesus Christ's name as a curse word, I'm like, oh, that actually wasn't his name, it was actually Yahshua, so you're not offending me. But it does offend me, actually, and it really kind of bugs, it's the only one that really bugs me, just because it's not like I'm walking around being like, Muhammad, or Buddha. So, I mean, it's one of those things that, I think God is a big enough God that's not offensive. I think that this notion of taking God's name as vain is much deeper. And for this context, it was, don't trivialize that which I've given you. Number 4, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy, keep it set apart. Like, in other words, I gave you a gift, you need to use it. Sabbath is a gift of the covenant. It is the sign of the covenant. It's there for our benefit. Don't neglect it. Interestingly enough, I will say, and I'd just like to add this as just to be a little cheeky, the covenant, when it goes through the lists of the Ten Commandments, I don't think it's in Exodus, I think it's in Deuteronomy, but the explanation of it was, he lists a Sabbath for everyone, maidservants, male oxen, female oxen, whatever. The only thing it doesn't list is his wife.
Well, somebody's going to put
but I would argue that the wife was included in the covenant, because usually it was the first female included. I know you're doubting me. Go back and look. I was always kind of like, that's kind of odd. In sort of joke, but obviously it does cover the wife as well. But I think the relationship between the husband and wife were meant to be so tight that the wife's salvation or inclusion in that would have been considered normative and not needed to be said. Number 5 goes into others. Honor your father and mother. I think the commandment that I think that most people in our society have probably broken the most, and all of these, I think we're just, where there's so many ways that we don't honor our parents, in particular in Western culture. That's all I'll say. I could go on an hour-long tangent on that, but I won't. And that's something that actually I wrestled with greatly. Like, what does it mean to honor my father and my mother, and caring for my mother's death, through her death? I mean, that was I say it jokingly, but I do think there's something about honoring, and I don't think that honoring necessarily has to manifest itself in that way. I think it's to your snotty attitude sometimes. So, just kidding.
In that way, do you agree, Grandma?
Number 6, don't murder. We can pretty much agree that that's a reasonable one. I don't think I need to go into reasons why. That's because it's taking someone's life, but don't commit adultery. And this is where we get into something interesting. This is not don't commit sexual infidelity. This is do not have sexual relations with another man's property. And the reason I say that is because there were still concubines. There was all sorts of, there was the sexual norms of that time were so different than they were today. The rest of these deal with property. And in this society, it was about a man relating to a man, not about men relating to women. And so what it's saying is, don't violate another man's stuff. Most importantly, the most important way, it's singled out this relationship that he has with his wife. You can't violate that. This does not mean that there wasn't extramarital relations with men of that time. It just means that it couldn't be with, and part of the reason you have to ask yourself that in various forms is when the spies go to Rahab, to a brothel, they weren't there for the drinks or the food or whatever the phrase is. They were there probably because it was a place of disrepute, but you have different sexual mores throughout the history of Israel. So, but my point is that it's pointing to the idea of don't violate the most important things in another person's life, and in this case, another man's. In the same way, don't steal from another man. Don't steal his property. Women and children were property, which is why you could have multiple wives and multiple concubines and multiple midwives or maidwives. Sister wives. We've all seen Big Love, right? Just kidding. Number 9, don't bear false witness. Again, deals with the relationship you have with your neighbor. Don't lie about them. Don't bear false witness. Don't do something that is deceptive. It's really not saying don't lie ever. I'm not saying that God's saying that you should lie, but I mean, when I look back at Rebecca, good old Becky, she concocted a pretty good, that was before sin was established, but the point is that she concocted a pretty good lie that God deemed as useful and righteous, because she's the one who followed that line and allowed that to happen. But these are circumstantial, and this is why, again, I don't think they apply and really should go on many walls, but because the greater commandment that we should have on our wall is love the Lord God with all your heart, soul, and mind, love your neighbor as yourself. That's all you should have. But don't cover your neighbor's spouse or possessions. that's the 10th one, and there's a difference between jealousy, me saying, you know what, I really like your car. I wish, I kind of wish I had one too. That's human desire. Coveting is, I want you not to have that so that I can have it. It's, I want to take that from you. It's in the same vein that adultery is. I want what is yours, and I want it to be mine. This is what made David's adultery, taking another man's wife, when he had thousands of other concubines. He could have, picked any women, countless women, but he wanted what someone else had. He coveted someone else's, and he took it and he violated. These things all point to the idea that, again, we love our neighbors as ourselves. Love your neighbor as yourself. Don't violate that sense of trust and relationship. Moving on, 1407 BC, you have the bronze serpent. This is important, and it comes to play in Paul and writing about the idea of Christ being that serpent lifted up, which I think is a great and interesting metaphor. Where are we at this here? And then I won't say much about that other than the fact that comes up every year. Christ lifted on the cross. Those who believed that looking at the serpent would heal them were healed. In the same way, those who believe in Christ lifted up on the cross will be healed. So that, again, there's there's connective tissue. So it's important to understand, one, so that when you hear in the New Testament it's mentioned, you know that this was from something that God provided a supernatural way of healing them. Again, God's provision for them. Around 1425 BC, you have the Ark of the Covenant created, and in Exodus 25, you have the specifications of it. I always like to reference the Indiana Jones movie when all of those evil spirits come out. I don't think that's what would actually happen. I'm not saying something would actually happen. I think the Ark of the Covenant is somewhere. I just think we don't know exactly where it's at, and I think it's supposed to contain whatever was left of the tablets. That's not important to me. That's historical materialism. What is important to me is that the Ark of the Covenant represents something far greater, and that was God's presence. And I've said this time and time again, but for the record of this, Adam and Eve, God walked with in the cool of the evening. The relationship was broke. You see God popping down, having relationships with people all the way to Noah, makes a deal with Noah. Again, we don't know what form that looked like. We just know that there was an interaction. Same thing with Abraham. In fact, we don't really get physical manifestations of God until the burning bush, and then which shows a closeness, but that's God popping down. And then you have the Israelites beginning their journey into the wilderness, led by a cloud during the day and a pillar of fire by night. And the idea that God was leaving, and that means God was with them. And then you have the development of the Ark of the Covenant, and you have the tabernacle established in this period, and both of those point to God dwelling with the Israelites. Now they had their God in a box, and they took God's presence. I know I can't help but make jokes. They took God's presence with them. And this is why when the Ark of the Covenant is stolen and then bad things start happening to the foreign nations stole, they're like, we don't want that thing. Because they didn't want God's presence, because it didn't work that way. But and then it was returned, and then this is why then the temple is built, because it became God's permanent house on earth. It was God's earthly house. You know, they have some people have like, I have a house in Paris. God's like, oh, I have a house on earth. Okay, so now they're ready. After 40 years have passed. And in 1406, you have Numbers, in Numbers 13, you have Joshua and the spies. They go to check out the new land to see what's happening. They report back that it's this sweet deal, milk and honey sort of thing. And they're excited about that. And then a threat comes upon them, and they have to escape, and they find solace in the arms of a prostitute. No, I don't know if actually in her arms, but here's the thing. Rahab wasn't just any prostitute. She is included in the line of Christ. So somewhere in the line she's mixed in. She wasn't, and she was a Canaanite. She was not Jewish. She helped them escape. And as I say many times, there had to have been a lot of windows in that wall. Why did they go there? Probably because it was a place of disrepute, more questionable values. Maybe they frequented it for other reasons. I don't know. This is why I think that then they escape that way. But Rahab becomes the first sort of symbol of non-Jewish inclusion. And we see that again listed in Matthew. They go back, they make their way into the promised land in 1406, again around the same time of the narrative. And then in the next card you see by 1374, you have, which is, I don't know, I wrote down, how many years was that? Just over 30 years. They're worshiping Canaanite idols. Remember, those who were the Israelites in the wilderness, anyone who came out of Egypt, they didn't get to enter the promised land. Only those born in the wilderness who had no memory, no pictures to look at, no videos to review, no image of what, if someone was like, yeah, pyramid, and you're like, I don't know what that looks like. You're like, oh, a big triangle thing. You're like, no, I've never seen one before. And you're like, do you have a picture? And they're like, we don't have pictures yet. And they're like, oh, it's a triangle. And they're like, oh, that doesn't help me. They had no memory of what Egypt was. They only had a memory of God dwelling with them in the desert or in the wilderness for 40 years. And when they enter into it, the commandment they're given is, do not, one of the commandments they're given is, do not have relations or do not assimilate into with the foreign people. Yeah.
Do you not think that given it was an oral, traditional oral culture, they would have told stories and had some sort of collective memory that way?
Yeah, I'm sure they would have. But, I mean, what is the extent of those oral stories? You don't know. Not only that, but after 40 years in the lifespan of people, even those in Egypt, 400 years of slavery, there would have been anything that my guess is that the stories they would be told were overarching stories that probably inform the text that we read, but they weren't like and they could have had pictures. I mean, they could have drawn, but even then, you seeing a pyramid, and I was just sort of being, a little facetious there, but the idea of seeing a pyramid or something like that, or what it would have been like to live a life of slavery, was something that this
It's a whole new
generation
generation. They walk out the
had no
door.
idea.
Yeah, yeah.
They had no notion of slavery.
Did any of
As
us
far
go-
as the actual work of it. and
The
what
embodiment
it's
of
like
that
to be
slavery,
under
yeah.
That kind of curse, I mean, obviously they heard about it.
And I don't know psychologically what that does, but it's got to play into it. I'm no psychologist. John, what were you saying?
Oh, no. Oh, I was gonna ask, did the scrolls ever have pictures?
I don't know. I mean, I know that the Book of Kells is one of the first illustrated. I'm sure there were pictures before that, but I don't know if they were concerned as much. I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, when you look at the ancient pieces of the papyrus, that you don't see a lot of like designs on them. But so that the truth is, I don't know. I really don't know. But my guess would be it was probably.
Egyptians did.
Well, I guess the Egyptians did, but that was because there was pictographs,
Yeah,
though.
but it's
A different language.
Yeah, very different language, but
That's true.
I just meant time-wise, they did exist, not in that culture.
Not in that culture, but so they could have. They just weren't. They weren't a very artsy bunch. All right, so here's what happens next, and I know we're probably we'll make it down to King David. On your sheets, you'll notice. So the Israelites went south in terms of their relationships. They started intermingling. They started falling back to their old ways. And God's like, "Come on, people! After all of this, we're still doing the same thing." Around 1235, you have the entry of something called the Judges, the era of the Judges. Joshua was actually considered maybe even one of the first judges. And I should have said, and I don't have a card for this, I skipped over it, but after in the time of the wilderness after the Ark of the Covenant, they were divided into tribes, and they were positioned around the tabernacle in tribes, and this is where the Levites were given authority by God and anointing by God through Aaron to basically govern the people. And as those laws developed and they became sort of judges, it's kind of like if I was meant to be a civil judge, you'd be like, "Well, that's not really your job." Well, yeah, this is where that divide came. And God, and to take that sense of duty away from the priests, you have the entry of the judges into, and the judges were those who were there to pronounce judgment and to be the ones to help divide, and they were to lead, and they became sort of civic leaders more so than spiritual leaders. The three
Did you
that
say they were from the tribe of Levi?
they were not. Levi was the priestly tribe, so you had to be from a priestly. You had to be
So
from the
do we
Levi.
have the 12 tribes at this point?
You do. That's what I'm saying. Around the sometime around the Ark,
Okay.
and
Is that when basically the second law was given, the real specific, all the.
by the end of the 40 years, they would have had that, yeah, and it would have been
Makes
written
sense,
down.
because you had all these people that had escaped Egypt, where all they ever knew was what the king and
They were told.
what they were told, and now you have all these people in the desert.
They need
He
some
has to tell
organization.
them how to live and how to organize and how to. There were no jails. There were no.
No, yeah.
This is how this, and if this happens, this is what you do, and if this person does this, then this is what you do.
Yeah.
He was showing them how a moral people live.
And all of those laws that came out in but comics will look at this. I mean, a lot of people have poked at fun at the Levitical laws. Some of them are so absurd and so minute, and so you got to say, did God really give that to them? Or was that just an embellishment of the people with a Levite priest? I don't know. I mean, like the answer is I don't know to that. But they lived by them. But by the time, but this was like a 40-year refinement process to try to get a people in order. It didn't take. It's the whole point.
Still hasn't.
It still hasn't. You're right. You're absolutely right. It still hasn't. So the three judges I want to just point to, as that I often do, are actually one of them is not really a judge, just sort of an extension of a judge. Gideon is one that usually people talk about, but Deborah is one of the main. She was the only official female judge in Israel, but she played a significant role in emancipating Israel after 20 years of Canaanite oppression. during the time when they succumbed to it. And to the extent that in Judges 5, there's the song of Deborah that heralds her name. And what it ends with what is depicted in the little card, which is Jael, who was, Jael was a Kenite from the Kenite tribe. And she was married to one of the leaders there. And basically, as Deborah got the General Barak to basically fight, and they basically overcame this Canaanite military force, led by a guy named Sisera. This woman named Jael lured him into a tent and then put a tent spike through his head. And it's although she's not technically a judge, like, you can't not illustrate that story.
There's a book called Lead Like Jael.
Lead Like Jael, yeah.
Whoa.
And you got to appreciate, in the black and white, you can't appreciate it, but I'll show you, in the color version of this, I added a little color blood, so you don't,
Wouldn't last very long, like that.
So the other one that you might be familiar of, just to kind of frame it in the time frame of when these people came, is,
The point was she was ready.
She had a
was
plan.
ready.
She had a plan to murder somebody.
When it came, she was ready. So that's sort of the point of the book.
she had strong, and she, I mean, I don't know if I could
And she was
pop a
She knew
tent
who
peg
he
through
was.
it.
she knew how to use
Yeah,
a tent peg.
Yeah, they should have some biblical trading cards, and it shows with the tent peg. Samson is another one. So when you knew the story of Samson, Delilah also made a new movie, part of my childhood. But in terms of placing Samson in a period, Samson was in the period of the judges.
He wasn't a judge, but he was in the period.
No, he was a judge.
He was a
Samson
judge.
was a judge.
Okay.
Yeah, Samson was a judge. But he's in that period of the judges. Then in the timeline sequence following that, and I think is 1140 BC. You have the story of Ruth. Ruth is a Moabite woman who upon the death of their male counterparts, follows her mother-in-law Naomi back to Israel, where she's taken in by her kin Boaz and his family, and basically, long story short, finds favor with him and becomes, although she was a Moabite, although truthfully she probably had some Jewish blood in there anyways. I mean, we don't know. There's a region anyways, it's all sort of intermingled. I mean, what is really, but she comes back in, she's in the line, but she's not considered Jewish. That's the important thing. But what's important about her, and this is, and we talk about this every Christmas, is Ruth marries Boaz, and they give birth to Obed. Obed marries someone, I don't remember her name. It'll come to me. And they have Jesse. And Jesse is the father of David, hence the Jesse tree. The point is,
So Jesse was Ruth and Boaz's grandson.
yes, King David is in a direct line to a Moabite woman who was not Jewish. Again, God's plan for inclusion always included reconciling other nations. 1100 or 1110, how do you say that? 1100, 1100 BC, 1100 BC. You have Hannah and Samuel coming to the temple. You see now the beginning of a shift from the judges, although Samuel is also considered one of the later judges. Eli and Samuel are in this later judge category. Samuel is also considered sort of a prophet voice. And so you have Samuel, but Hannah offers Samuel to the temple, and this becomes the first example in the biblical narrative of a child officially being offered to the temple for sacred purposes, and is something that then carries on, and we find throughout history. And in fact, in monastic communities through the last 2,000 years, confrates, as they were called, were offered by nobles to, often more for education than for spiritual formation, but the notion of offering your child for divine service is something that was established in this narrative. That "Here am I, Lord, I hear you calling in the night" comes from the hymn from that comes from the story of Eli and Samuel, and it really is the idea that we give ourselves to the holiness of the work. When on this page 1030 or 1040. 3 BC. The people, at this point, you see the shift from the judges. They're like, hey, we're being led by judges and a couple prophets and these priests, but all these other nations have kings. And the Israelites get grumpy, they want a king, they choose their own king. As the story goes, well, all you need to know is the people chose Saul. He governed the people. He was not chosen by God. And he is a part of the narrative in the sense of he brings in David into throne, but as we know, the conflict between David and Saul become a huge piece because Saul doesn't want David to overthrow him, but it's the shift of power from human power back to God's power and God's divine providence.
Was Saul the first king?
Saul was the first king, and they chose their own. And he was tall, which is why in the picture his tower's above. Samuel anointed him, and Samuel also had been the one to then anoint David. But you see then, and really, I don't know why, as I went back through these cards, I'm like, I didn't even include David and Goliath. I don't know if that was an intentional choice, but I kind of thought, we kind of overemphasize it a little bit in biblical stories. Like when we grab onto it, it's a great tale. It also says that David killed animals, lions and bears with his bare hands or whatever, like there's a lot of history around kings in every culture that lifts them up and ascribes things to them that may or may not have happened. I'm not saying that just because it's in the scripture it says it happened, that it actually happened. I am saying that people believed it happened, and people still believe it happened. Really isn't important, but the notion of, again, something that's small and humble being used to conquer something that's big and earthly.
I think it's interesting too in that story. To me, the most important part is that he says to them, God promised, like what? God promised, like what, he had his focus on God when all the others just saw, the threat and so forth, and they forgot that God would give them
And
power
through the most
deliverance.
unlikely, honestly,
Yeah.
if I was in the Goliath's army, I'd been like, it was a lucky shot, people. Like the whole army isn't like, come on.
Yeah, we got this.
We still have it. We're still a bigger race. Anyway, so in 1024, David's anointed king. You have the story then of David and king. And on the next page, really, we'll just go to the next one. You'll see King Solomon. I want to say a few things. So you basically have the peak of Israel's existence, the peak of the establishment of their kingdom goes from David. You see God's favor. I don't have anything about his fall with Bathsheba and things that happened to that. What I do want to point to, and again, I'm looking back at this thinking, how did I miss that on the cards? There should be a card for the Davidic covenant, because God made the covenant with the house of David, with King David. King Solomon will come after that. But what I want to point to is that when God establishes the Davidic covenant, it offers 4 things. Establishment of David's offspring. What does that sound like?
Go forth and multiply or something.
The Abrahamic covenant, I'll give you descendants, more than the stars in the sky. To build a house for his name. So that God would use David to build a house for God's name. So the establishment of his name. So to this day, what do we say? The house of David. An everlasting throne, which is interpreted as being a land, a space, a establishment. These, the 3 promises that are echoed in the Davidic covenant are parallel to the promises in the Abrahamic covenant. But the last thing that he adds is his steadfast love. He says, no matter what, despite your sin, I'll never take my love away from you. And this was the segue to what we'll look at in next week when we talk about the prophets, to the Jeremiah covenant of saying, reiterating, doubling down on this idea that I'll never take my love away from you. David had King Solomon from Bathsheba, again, through human brokenness, God redeems. And the only thing I'll say about King Solomon, and we'll pick this up next week when we talk about the divided Israel, but King Solomon comes in, he's the wisest, he's the smartest, he's the richest, he has the most wives, he built the temple, he's got everything, and eventually he starts to marrying wives, or taking wives from other nations and starts worshiping their idols as well, and then it divides. We'll see the north and the south divide between Rehoboam and Jeroboam, and we'll talk about the division and then what leads into the period of exile and then what follows after that next week. So, thanks so much. Any last questions? Yeah.
Was Judaism not matrilineal when, like,
What is matrilineal?
their heritage, their lineage determined by the mother's line? When going back to, Boaz and Ruth,
It must not have been because she was a Moab,
right?
but I mean, that's
I
what's
mean,
important
now,
about Christ
things that they
and
can do
Mary.
now, right, that's why I was
Yeah.
curious if that's more modern.
I don't know, that'd be interesting. That'll be something you can share next week. All right, thanks, folks. We'll see you next week.